gentlemen, welcome to our first panel of the day at the Finance Forum, The Power of Climate Transition Plans, Navigating ESG Backlash Through Good Governance. And your moderator for this session is Kaya Axelsson, who is Net Zero Policy Engagement Fellow at the University of Oxford. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's absolutely wild to speak in this kind of silent disco fashion, so I hope to bring the energy, even as I know you're deep into your headsets. My name is Kaya Axelsson. I'm the head of Policy and Partnerships for Oxford Net Zero, which is an interdisciplinary research program at the University of Oxford. I'm joined by an incredible panel today, curated on the very topical issue of transition plans. I think transition plans seem to be at least in my circles, maybe they're not very cool circles, but the buzzword of the year. And we're just star-studded here in terms of expertise on that topic. I'm going to introduce my panel. Dr. Ben Caldecott is not only a professor at the University of Oxford and a colleague, he's also the co-head and secretary of the Transition Plan Taskforce and a member of the CCC. Then we have Sacha Sadan, who's director of ESG for the Financial Conduct Authority. We have Sean Kidney, CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, and Emily Faint, who's head of policy and partnerships at BSI, and who has been a leader in developing standards on sustainability and transition planning across the International Standard Organization system. Emily is also a research associate with me at Oxford Net Zero, providing partnership on our research on standardization and transition planning, and she joins us in that capacity today to comment in a global way about these new governance that we have as a result of much of the work of the panel today, and I think probably much of the work of all of you in our audience. So I'm going to join my panel. And feel free, of course, to add anything that I might have missed in the introduction as to what you'd like to share about your work. I'm going to start my first question over to the Secretary of the Transition Plan Taskforce and just say, Ben, why transition plans? You know, you started working on stranded assets and thinking quite a lot about risk. How do those things link together, and why are transition plans so important from both a risk and opportunity perspective?
Thanks so much, Kaya, and for that really kind introduction. This is a bit weird, actually, isn't it, speaking?
It's bizarre, yeah, I love it.
But I'm going to try and get used to it. So why transition plans? There are many reasons why, and we're at the Finance Forum. Lots of people will be thinking about the provision of transition finance, so capital financial services to help companies, help counterparties to transition, to achieve net zero. And that's great in theory, but how do we realize that in practice? And so transition plans and transition planning is a fundamental, foundational prerequisite for transition finance. So if you have credible transition plans, you can then link that to the provision of transition finance. So that's one reason. Another reason, more specifically in relation to the task force that I co-head the Secretariat of, is this regulatory requirements that are being introduced by the UK, but also by other jurisdictions. And those have arisen for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is to tackle greenwashing. So the context for this was a huge number of net zero commitments in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow. Fantastic. Lots there to be commended, but how will those promises be realized in practice? And so transition plans are about providing that framework to ensure that companies, financial institutions that have made commitments realize those commitments. The other thing, just quickly to say on transition plans and transition planning, is that a lot of the focus has been on the entity and its own decarbonisation. But when we're thinking about, obviously, financial services and financial institutions, we also need to think about investment portfolios and bank loan books and so on. And so one of the things we've been trying to deal with is essentially this challenge with net zero targets in finance, where you end up with sort of paper decarbonisation. People offload, financial institutions offload holdings in polluting companies, and there's a legitimate question there about whether that actually will help wider society achieve its decarbonisation aim. So when we're thinking about a transition plan, it's not just about the entity's decarbonisation strategy, it's also about how that entity is contributing to wider societal decarbonisation and what are the different levers available to that entity to achieve it, and that's going to be mission critical if we're going to achieve net zero by mid-century.
Thanks very much. So I think what I'm hearing is that transition planning helps you think not just about how your individual entity can get to net zero, but also from a system perspective. Sacha, on that, I'm gonna turn to you and ask, given this is a relatively new thing that people are doing. I mean, for some companies, they've been kind of in practice modeling this behavior in a good way for some time. What are key examples of successful climate transition plans that you see across businesses, and how are they evidencing that kind of systemic thinking that Ben referenced?
Well, good. Hi, everyone. Just to start, as a regulator, I think you touched on it, Ben, and obviously I'm on that group on TPT, and you and Kate have done a fantastic job on that. The first thing is people came to COP26 in Glasgow and all signed this thing called net zero by 2050. So it was great. All the finance people signed up to net zero by 2050. I'm sure some of them probably thought, now how do I do that and what do I do? And it's actually blooming difficult. And so the TPT and other things like that are there to try and help. But as a regulator, we're not wanting companies to say things that they're not acting on. So that's why we've been involved in this. So our anti-greenwashing rules that just coming in force in May the 31st are bigger and wider than just transition plans, but are absolutely in this plan. And so clear, fair and not misleading is one of the first things. Secondly, and when we talk to someone like the Aviva CEO, who's Dame Amanda Blanc, she'll say the hardest thing about transition plans, especially the first couple, is they're not very good or they've not got all the answers. So you've got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And so it's difficult. And when you've got a regulator, we've got to help them because this is forward-looking stuff. So good companies are not got just all the answers, but they're strategically doing it in the right way. Secondly, it's done from the top with the good companies. It's not a department in the corner just ticking a box. And that is really crucial. And thirdly, use the same metrics that others are using. So I'm spending a lot of my time, I'm off to Paris again today and to IOSCO later, securities regulator. Let's use ISSB. The only acronym I'm going to use, International Sustainability Standards Board, all use the same metrics, whether it's in Nigeria, China, Brazil, Hong Kong, Japan or Singapore, so that you can compare and contrast and believe or not believe.
I think that my favorite thing that you've just said there is that we have to all get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think acknowledging that we're all doing something new is really, really critical. And acknowledging that governments are doing something new by regulating in this way is it's really brave. And I think we all have to encourage companies to continue to be brave. And if they don't acknowledge their challenges, then we can't make good governance.
And just the last point, Kerry mentioned it. Kerry McCarthy, Shadow Climate Secretary. There are, and we've already announced it, we will probably be looking at putting transition plans for FTSE 100 companies soon as mandated, just like we did with TCFD, et cetera, et cetera. So this is coming.
That deserves a clap.
This is coming.
Thank you. And not just you. We've seen an 11-fold increase from our research in not just transition plan mandates, but disclosure and procurement. There's a huge regulatory push coming. I'm not sure if companies are aware, but they should be. Thank you so much for your work on that. Sean, I'm going to turn to you and ask a little bit about how this helps the finance world advance towards the climate solutions scale that we need.
Well, let's look at the background here. Most of the major rich countries in the world have committed to strong 2030 and 2050 targets. There is a policy-setting change that was brought together really at the Biden Climate Summit a few years ago in 2021, led by Europe's first commitment to 2030. That's changed things. There are policy changes that have come through. The IRA in the US, Inflation Reduction Act, the InvestEU, the GX plan in Japan and so on. These are incredible signs of actual action by government. It's leading to an investment boom. We haven't seen it in the UK yet, by the way, Minister. We need to see more of that in the coming forward. But perhaps that'll be the end of the year. The sense of change amongst investors is now palpable. First, there's the emissions reductions pathway that we have to achieve. And remember, it's 2030. Janet Yellen, US Secretary of Treasury, is more focused on 2030 than she is on 2050 because she understands it's front-loading the change that's required. The powers that governments have to do are limited, but we've seen change coming through. There is a second thing we need to understand, by the way, as well. We have lost the fight against climate change. We were now seeing 1.5 degrees happening already. We will see increasingly severe summers from now on. People will start dying in larger and larger numbers, and that will involve us preparing our cities, our urban environments especially, to be able to cope with heat. I mean, not just Dubai and New Orleans, but also London and Paris. We'll have to make a change. We'll have to transition to a different kind of urban environment, energy system and so on to be able to survive these. We're on a race to stop catastrophic climate change now. Our current trajectory is catastrophic climate change. Understand that. We haven't actually changed the course of history yet, although it's looking good because the economy is starting to turn. Because the economy is starting to turn, it brings something else into play, which is absolutely material to shareholders, to corporates, to investors, which is, it is very clear now there is a tsunami of change coming through the world economy. We see this beginning, solar, electrics, hydrogen and so on. The capex boom is already incredible. Now, for a corporation, it means you've got two things to worry about. Not just the commitments you might have made, often rhetorical and so on, which the FCA is trying to keep you honest about, but also the fact that if you don't take action, you are likely to disappear. You are likely to miss out on the wave that's coming through. And the investors, the global institutional investors that we speak to, are acutely aware that the world, they say the future has been decided, it will be green. The question is how quickly the change is going to happen and who are going to be the winners and losers. And transition plans, for me, are not primarily about compliance issues. They are not primarily about making sure you get your emissions down. They're about how you're going to survive the tumult that's coming through the global system. Transition opportunity plans is what we should be calling them. TOPS going forward. And we see that now becoming a dominant theme. It's not the discussion just in the UK. In Europe, we now see, again, a move to mandatory requirements for transition plans. But the Philippines has brought this in too. The Thai Central Bank has now required all banks to have transition financial instruments available by the end of this year. They don't know what to do. They're all freaking out. But the point is, it started with regulatory issues. In Japan, there's no regulatory push about this. There is a government push, but companies, and I've met with the CFOs of people like Mitsui and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, understand the future has changed. They are now planning for that difference. Now, what have we got to do here? Well, there are two things we have to do in the finance sector to make sure this works. One is we need to ensure those plans are commensurate with the opportunity in front of us and the challenge. That is, are they ambitious enough? You know, a little plan, putting on a pullover in winter, is not going to cut the mustard. We need to be looking at substantive changes to be able to survive this difference. We need to look at reference trajectories in each sector. In the electricity sector, how much transition do we actually need? Well, luckily, we've got the IEA net zero pathway that we can use as a reference in that particular sector. In each sector, we have to have more reference trajectories to be able to assess transition plans to ensure they are not, well, greenwashing in the parlance at the moment, or people being timid, which is really the issue, and whether they are ambitious enough in the circumstance. And a last point. Let me make no mistake, I do not believe that the bulk of industry can do this by themselves. I do not believe that steel companies in Europe can have aggressive transition plans in their own right, to see fast enough change, without the support of government. This only works, this transition, with clear, deep collaboration between the public sector and between the private sector. Transition plans of corporates need to be looking at what they need. What are the enabling steps that government should take? The change that we have to achieve is extraordinary. The reduction in emissions by 2035, 65%, is not a target, it's a minimum requirement. We can't do this by leaving it to market forces. We can't do this by leaving it to disclosure. Our transition plans need to incorporate a deep understanding of what we have to do as a society to allow our corporations to change. And that gives hopes to corporations. They can have an ambitious plan, but yeah, put dependencies. We do need to see breaks in competition law in Europe to allow airlines to collaborate, to let out large-scale contracts for sustainable aviation fuels to drive the price down to be equivalent to kerosene. We do need the auto companies of Asia to be able to group together to buy green steel, to let off large enough contracts to get the price down to achieve the change and so on. And that's going to require government to allow things, to support them and to convene. The change we have to make is enormous. Our transition plans have started. Now we need to make sure they're adequately ambitious for the challenge.
Thank you. And what an energizing message for the morning. It's not compliance, it's about survival opportunities. And I really like your point there about breaking competition law in favor of collaboration. Sometimes we need to make new laws, sometimes we need to break laws, not in that way, I suppose.
Just one thing, the CMA has already put out a green guidance agreement in this country to help companies talk to each other.
Yeah.
Already.
Yeah.
And the people who are using it at the moment are things like retailers, but less finance people. So use it. They're trying to help you, Sean.
Quite a few calls to action this morning. Emily, I think you have one for us as well. Our panelists have mentioned the need for common standardization, for benchmarks. This transition will not be successful unless policies are interoperable. How can standards support this effort in terms of scaling financing and developing transition plans that are backed by the money that they need?
What a great question, and what a phenomenal amount of momentum that you've built to queue up my answer, Sean. So I thank you very much for those comments. Before I get into that question, for those of you who don't know me and know BSI, I'm Emily Faint. I lead the Net Zero Policy team in the British Standards Institution, which, a fun fact I always like to give in these events, is actually the world's first standards body. So when we, as an economy, realized that we needed to do this thing called standardization, the original form of BSI was set up, I believe, in 1901. Of course, we love old things in the UK. But most relevantly to this discussion with that global mindset in mind is that we are one of the largest members of the formal international standard system, so namely the systems you may already have heard of, such as ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, IEC, and others. And the crucial distinction here that I want you to bear in mind as we have this discussion is that this is a system that convenes countries, not companies. It's not that companies are not involved, but companies and industry experts are members of national committees around the world. So the call to action that Kaya has alluded to will be coming soon, and will all be about how you can all make sure that your solutions that you're developing are connected to the system so that we can help scale it together and make sure it is backed up by true international consensus. But I want to address the question directly, first of all, before we get into that. So we have heard this stark message about what's at stake. We all know that. That's why this event is so full. And we've heard about the incredible momentum that has been built by initiatives such as the Transition Plan Taskforce and foundations such as the IFRS in innovating the idea that it is the responsibility of financial institutions and of companies to transition to help address the challenges of the climate crisis. I hope you're enjoying this sort of somber, dramatic music as a background to this message, by the way. However, what we must do is make sure that we are not just setting benchmarks, so rigorous science-based thresholds that tell us what good looks like, but we are also standardizing it. You'd be amazed how many times in my job I have to make the point that the point of standards is to standardize. So if we are not seeing these norms scaled, not just in high-income economies, but in all major jurisdictions, then we will not actually achieve the transition in a just and fair way, which we know is key and shouldn't be treated as an afterthought, but we also won't achieve it at the pace that we need to. So the role that standards have to play here is making sure that once we have innovated and normalized these ideas of what good looks like when it comes to transition plans, the KPIs that underpin them, and the transformative element that they need to contain that Sean's already alluded to, we need to make sure that that criteria is reflected in the existing and new formal international standards that already underpin the real economy. So ISO and the system it represents has been doing this for almost a century plus. There are over 25,000 international standards and thousands more of national standards all around the world. And this criteria isn't reflected in them. That's my big sort of siren to you all today. These things that we talk about in Innovation Zero, at COP, at Bonn, that we talk about as if it's the norm that everyone knows. I'm here to tell you that they don't. And it's because we are not connecting these solutions to the international standard system that actually the majority of companies, regulators and policymakers are using already. So these innovations, these pushes forwards are essential, and I commend and congratulate the great work that's been done here. But we must make sure that they are reflected in the updated criteria of the existing international standard system. And I'll leave you with one thought to think about before we move on to the next question, which is that if you are not aware, work is already underway to achieve this. It's BSI led the signing, backed up by members across the ISO system at COP26 for something known as the London Declaration. Now, this is a commitment from the international standard system to review and revise all existing international standards in line with the Paris Agreement and ensure that civil society is also better supported to participate in international standard development. Now, that is really key to make sure that we grasp this moment we're in, this transition moment we're in, so that all of the great work that is represented by my co-panelists and many more are reflected in this system. That is how we can make sure that no matter which standards system you're looking at, no matter which institution you're engaging with, you are seeing the same criteria, hearing the same thing, and this transition can get on with what it actually needs to do.
Thanks so much, Emily. And our panelists, I'm going to be greedy and keep you all for one more question each before I turn questions over to our audience, so I can see you're already typing away. Ben, actually 2 questions for you, because I know you can handle it. So the first question is quite simple. With the difference between kind of ISSB, you probably get this question all the time, basic disclosure and this kind of new step towards transition planning, you probably get this all the time. What is the huge value add? Companies are sort of saying they're reeling with frameworks. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think there has been a concerted effort, and the ISSB kind of represents this to try and consolidate and bring these things together to try and reduce the complexity. So when we've been working on transition plan disclosure frameworks and the work of the TPT, we have made sure that we are building off and connecting with and not duplicating the work of the ISSB and other things that are out there, so they're completely consistent and aligned. And I think there are, obviously greater calls from business and from finance to ensure that consistency, and Emily's points about BSI and ISO are well taken.
Thank you. I'd love to hear that. And my second question for you related to that is, we've seen an incredible growth in mandatory disclosure, especially in the last few years. I think in the next few years, over 50% of the world's major economy will be covered by mandatory disclosure. Do you see transition planning going that way as well, partly because of this runway you've created working so well with ISSB?
So absolutely. So as jurisdictions around the world endorse the ISSB talks about transition plans, and if you're going to do a transition plan, then the best practice disclosure framework for doing that is the TPT. So absolutely. I would, though, just say 2 things. One is disclosure requirements for large companies, particularly listed companies, is not the only use case for transition plans. So it's sort of building off what Sean was saying and others have said too. There are lots of other use cases. And I think that's going to be really interesting, particularly in the UK, potentially with a new government. How are they going to introduce transition planning requirements across the economy? Because that's where we need to get to. So procurement, for example. I mean, there's already a commitment that was made in Glasgow around you need a net zero target to get a government procurement contract. I don't actually know whether that's been implemented. But if you're going to do it properly, well, you should also not only have a net zero commitment, but you should have a credible transition plan. If you're going to access public finance, concessional finance from the British Business Bank or UK Infrastructure Bank or UK Export Finance, then maybe you should have a credible transition plan. Or if you're in a regulated sector, the water industry, what's your transition plan? Or if you want to build 10,000 new homes in Cambridgeshire, then what's your transition plan? So you can see how this can be introduced across the economy in a wide variety of different ways. And then the other thing on disclosure, and this is why one of the reasons I think transition plans are really important, and transition plan disclosures are quite important. I've always been a bit of a kind of disclosure skeptic in terms of its ability to really change much or to provide the information we need to analyse companies. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. Backward-looking information. There are all sorts of assurance issues. You're not going to get everyone to disclose consistently. We could talk about that if you really wanted to. But I think the thing about transition plan disclosures and disclosure requirements is that you're not you're getting them to disclose their strategy, their plan, and introducing accountability for that plan. And I think that's really important for ensuring that it improves over time. So this point around constant improvement is really, really key. And just the other thing to say about that, and this is something that we capture in the disclosure framework, is that we've got to think about how we embed this in organizations over decades. And I'm increasingly feeling that leads us towards culture and organizational culture, and how we get that right and incentivize that over time. And that's an area that I think we need to do, as researchers and academics need to do much more work on.
Yes, yeah. Closing the ambition loop, seeing how it all lands with the companies. I want to turn now to Sacha, because you mentioned this May 31st update, sustainability disclosure labeling rule. I've been wondering as a researcher for some time about the policy sequencing, the way that we kind of roll out these different measures that we need for the whole accountability landscape. You hear a lot the words greenwashing, and you hear a lot the words green hushing. And something that I've been wondering about is, until we have mandatory transition planning for all companies, and we're already kind of cracking down on their greenwashing, is there a concern that some companies will just quietly step back and fail to do anything at the risk of getting kind of slapped on the wrist, or financial organizations as well? What do you think about that?
Well, I think the green hushing is new. We've had much more greenwashing and over-optimism than we have of the other. And so sometimes slowing down people's expectations or their announcements is not a bad thing, because pragmatic is very important. But first thing, anti-greenwashing rules are coming out May 31st. They're linked to the Advertising Standards Authority, linked to the CMA. We put 15 examples of what would be bad. The industry wanted that because they said, we haven't got guidance. You should know what greenwashing is. I think Ben would know that. But we've helped the industry. But now we've helped them, we'll make sure we enforce that.
Yeah.
So that's that. The labelling goes back to the point you made. Disclosures are great, and if we keep asking corporates to do more and more and more, and not just public companies, private companies, banks, insurance, everything, nice, but this is, I've been in the industry for 30 years, the finance industry. What about ESG ratings? What about assurance? Make sure these numbers are real. So I'm working with the auditors to make sure they've got capacity to assure the numbers, because otherwise the numbers are marking your own homework, and we all know what that means. So, and ESG ratings, we've put out the code of conduct. We work with Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan. ESG ratings are quite powerful. People are using them to make decisions. Well, are they using transition plans? How much forward-looking information are they using? And then the last point you mentioned are labels, which start July the 31st, but implemented by December. If you want to use the word transition, sustainable, responsible, Paris-aligned, net zero, you're going to have to do certain things, and the regulator's going to do it. I'm going to Paris to try and help them to link their rules with ours. But one of those things was we used the word transition, and we went and talked to 19,000 consumers. They went, transition to what? So we've changed it to improve. The label is called improve. But consumers want it. 79% of the consumers that we tested said they wanted their money to do good. So back to Sean's point, this is happening. Why were people selling these products? Because they were in demand. So we just got to make sure there's trust and integrity in that market, and that's where the regulator comes in. But not just on companies. Ratings, assurance, asset managers, asset owners, they've all got to do their job, because they can make sure that they work. Because otherwise, I've seen companies do a great transition plan and their cost of capital is higher than someone who hasn't got one.
Right.
That's not going to solve the problem.
Right. Thank you. That's a perfect segue to Sean. What do you look at when you are trying to find whether a transition plan is backed by credible action? So we've just heard of, cost of capital as an example. What makes a transition plan real?
Well, the first thing is that it recognises the opportunity, the hidden word in the middle of transition plan. And we, as I said earlier, we need to start calling these transition opportunity plans, because change is a come what may. Whether it's coming from the regulators, whether it's coming from the global industrial revolutions underway, this is not really anything special. This is not extra to a strategic plan. This is simply forward-looking strategic planning. That's all it is. It's part of the mainstream work. It's not an add-on. It's not a compliance add-on, specifically, is what I'm going to say. So what do we look in those cases? Well, clearly, we want something which properly looks at the changes coming through the world system. That's step one, right? Now, some of those changes are the regulatory changes, sure enough. What you've got to disclose, fair enough. What investors are expecting nowadays. Are you dealing with the emissions requirements that investors and regulators are continually asking for? Sure. I want to keep pressing resilience, transition to resilience as well, because insurance companies are now making this very much a requirement, and we need to alter. Are you transitioning to ensure your assets are of reduced risk of being impacted by the 1.5 degree impact that's coming through now? Because that's going to become very real and very material. If you have a toy factory in a flood zone, it is almost certain to get flooded in the next 10 years. You might start finding it hard to get insurance. That's a business cost. So that's a transition plan, et cetera, et cetera. But above all, are you cognizant of the opportunities coming through? So I often talk in emerging markets. You might be thinking about making money out of fossil fuels, but where's your nickel strategy? Where's your copper strategy? Where's the lithium strategy, and so on? And that is developing, because that's the opportunity that's coming through as a lot of the growth of electric vehicles, renewables, and so on. So that's the first step. Mm-hmm. The second step we look for is that when you are making claims about your emissions improvement, then are you adequately ambitious? Well, how do we assess that? Well, actually, funnily enough, there is a lot of work around about how we do this. So the IEA has a net zero steel industry pathway. So if we're looking for a steel company putting out a transition plan, we would expect their forward trajectory of emissions planning to be at least consistent with the IEA's net zero steel pathway, and so on and so on. There's a group of us working on this sort of stuff where we're cats, but we're working together, oddly enough. SBTI, Transition Pathways Initiative, ACT, World Benchmarking Alliance, and so on, who are coming up with different kinds of forward guidelines for different sectors, different purposes, and so on. Over the course this year, you will see much greater consistency and coherence amongst us all in terms of providing clear guidance to corporate industry. But it's not as if these pathways don't exist. They are already around there in most sectors. Agriculture is a bit complicated, but it is coming through. So that's what we look for, which is effectively third-party validation. If you're a BP and you're making a claim about your 2050 targets, is there someone credible, to use the term Ben came up with, who's reviewed this and says it's reasonable? Is it in line with what we need to do going forward? Opportunities, well, emissions reductions. But there are a couple of key rules in here. Offsets to pick up the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We do not think that front-loading offsets works. Yeah. Neither does SBTI, by the way. The announcement's actually been misunderstood a little bit.
It has been misunderstood.
We think
it's not an announcement.
That backloading, that is in the 2040s, offsets are going to be absolutely necessary to achieve our challenge. But that needs a bit more work and a bit more guidance before we can accept that. So right now, keep out of offsets, work on the envelope of your assets and how you change those. For example, there are some emerging rules along those lines. They will start popping up in the Standards Board kind of guidelines going forward, I'm sure. It is a changing area. Start off, as we said at the beginning, working on transition plans because we've got a short window.
Okay.
We've got a short window. By the end of next year, we really need to have, if we have a chance of meeting our 2030 requirements for emission reductions, everyone who's any size to have a transition plan. We'll work on the quality of it next year, but listed companies, municipalities and cities, and countries. The biggest transition plan opportunity is the NDC revision opportunity that's currently underway. We need all those country plans being filed with the UN COP next year to be transition opportunity plans as well.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I can't help it because you brought it up. I think that since the SBTI statement was put out, it's had quite the splash, and it's raised this question of what the appropriate use of market-based mechanisms are. And market-based mechanisms is a very, very wide term. One thing that people have interpreted from that statement is that, you should just be investing through the voluntary carbon market as is, kind of the way most people think of credits. Another way that people continue to be referencing in this forum that I'm noticing is the use of certificates or attribute certificates for transition financing to develop advanced market commitments, long-term financing for supply chains for the type of breakthroughs that we might need, for example, in steel, cement. And those types of contracts, to come to Emily now, really require standardization to make them work. If you've got an offtake agreement that requires, a certain product standard in terms of its benchmarking. You need a standard, perhaps a responsible steel standard, as has been developed, to ensure that off-takers should be in fact buying the product when it's available. Emily, I'm going to turn to you and ask you, how is the standardization community going to be able to keep up with the amount of sustainable standards we need? And are there meta standards out there to ensure that the standards we're setting keep us on track with the sustainability transition?
Say standards and sustainability one more time.
I'll try.
Great question. So I think that the good answer, as I said, to refer back to my previous point, is that this work is underway. So the way in which we cope with the demand is because we've set up a truly international system where almost every country in the world has a government-appointed national standards body, with BSI being the UK's, which has a dedicated committee of experts on that given topic to either develop new standards where they're identified as needed or revise existing ones. And the way this system works is that an international standard is monitored in the market after publication, and they're looked at for review at least every 5 years or sooner if a market need is identified for it to be revised. The good news I'm here to give you is that this infrastructure already exists. We do not need to worry about struggling to find foundations or NGOs coming together to deal with this alone. The good point is that we have a system, but we need to make sure we use it, which is why, to refer to my previous call to action, again, if you are working on the development of any kind of benchmark, initiative, framework, or standard variation therein, please make sure, one, that you come and talk to me after this, so I can make sure that you're connected to your own standards body's national committee, but make sure that you go and tell your stakeholder network about this gap. Because again, so much of this work that we've identified we need is already happening. We are just still, despite efforts, still unfortunately doing it a little bit in silos. So that's one thing we can change quite easily. As I mentioned earlier, the ISO climate commitment, the London Declaration, is that commitment that was made at COP26, and we're years into this work to revise all international and national standards in line with the needs identified. So you can get involved in that starting from today. Already, a key example of impact I could give here to show how this is making progress is that the requirements for all management system standards in ISO have been updated to include requirements on consideration of climate change, touching both on the mitigation points and Sean's excellent point about resilience, so that anyone who is complying with these management system standards, regardless of whether they see themselves as having a role in climate action, which of course we all do, must make sure they are demonstrating to those auditors how they factored that into their work. So that affects already instantly 2 million certifications globally. The scale of impact we can achieve through this work really does know no limits. Kaya also mentioned sort of the idea of meta standards. We've got lots of different sectoral standards that are being revised in line with this commitment, but we also need to make sure that we are connecting this up to overarching standards, end-to-end frameworks that bring this all together in the international standard system. Now, something that really astonished me when I joined this world a couple of years ago is that there was no international standard on net zero. And yet you can't get away from the word when we go to any conference or any boardroom meeting of any kind about this topic. And so BSI was very pleased to convene a global process in 2022 with input from over 100 countries and over 1,200 experts, bringing in expertise from many of the initiatives you've heard today, including SBTI, the Race to Zero, and many others, to build the first deliverable in the ISO system that actually defines what net zero means. Again, something that we really have long needed, and connects all of the different aspects of work that colleagues like the Transition Plan Taskforce have covered in one document, referring to each of these initiatives as you need for further methodology. Now, the exciting thing that I want to make sure you're all aware of is that this is currently under consideration in the international standard system to be converted into the first formal international standard on net zero for organizations, which will then embed and scale that definition and all of the different requirements that we've just discussed on this panel across over 170 countries. Now, that will make the turning of the wheel that much quicker in all these different jurisdictions that institutions like the ISSB, TPT, and others are working hard to make sure they're all talking to each other and coming together on a common understanding of what we need to do to transition. So those two key things are things that I would like all of you to take away from today. Join your national standards committees, and if you don't know how, I'm very happy to talk to you. You can go to iso.org/members for a list of all country committees around the world, or come and talk to me if you're based in the UK, and I can help you join the UK's one. Read about the London Declaration. You can Google it, and it will tell you just the sheer scope of work that will undoubtedly affect the sectors you work in or those of your stakeholders. And you can also read iso.org/net zero, the ISO net zero guidelines, which is expected to be the basis of the first international standard in net zero. So through these examples, which I'm afraid due to time I can only pull out some examples, there are many, many other fantastic areas of work going on right now. You can see how we are all working together, hopefully with your input, to cover not just the overarching standards that are missing, that we need urgently, that will unlock certification and assurance all around the world, but we are also making sure that all of the existing sectoral standards that you already use are also being revised in line with the Paris Agreement and the new urgent market needs that we all realize we need to address.
Thank you. I told you there's a few call to actions on this panel, a very active panel. Okay, our last question for everyone, and I'll let whoever wants to jump in, just because I think it's a fascinating question. How do you assess ambitiousness, or to use Ben's word, credibility in transition plans for those sectors or even geographies in which scientific pathways are, in this question it says not out there. I think they're often out there, but they're hard to define. How are you defining ambition for transition plans? I think the IEA was a global pathway mentioned. What about at the sectoral or kind of geography-specific level?
Look, there's a lot of work happening about this. Thank you very much. Thank God I've got help, as we all need. There's a lot of work happening around this. We've published at the Climate Bonds Initiative a reference trajectory in steel industry, chemical industry, cement, shipping, electricity utilities, referencing other work that's been done which isn't necessarily applied to finance or business but can be applied, such as IEA net zero pathways, etc. So there's work happening. Equally, other organisations like Transition Pathways Initiative have a variety of guidance, all of which is kosher. It's all out there. What we haven't necessarily done is brought it together into one umbrella. Okay. And that's to make it easy for people. And I'm acutely aware that the secret to transition now will be to make it easy for people to know what to do. For that, we need the regulators, for example. If we can get ESMA, FCA and others to be saying, this is where you look, in other words, doing the due diligence discovery for corporates, it's going to make life a lot easier. That's happening. That discussion is underway. There are reference trajectory out there. If you look at our website, if you look at Transition Pathways Initiative website, you'll see a bunch of stuff you can use today, which already has broad investor support. And this isn't just abstract, by the way. You know, we've seen now the growth in Asia of a transition bond market. The Japanese government issued an $11 billion climate transition bond in February, which was climate bond certified, by the way, and so on, which got incredible investor report, and amazingly, for a Japanese bond, which has got an extraordinary tight spread, got a 1.5 basis points benefit for the transition benefit. So, you know, the UK gets 2 basis points benefit, and it's lower rated than the Japanese bond. So, you know, this is started. The financial systems there, investors are showing they want this sort of stuff. And of course, on the equity side, there's an engagement story. So it's not academic. The rules are already there that can be used. There are people taking advantage of it. What we now need to do is just build up momentum. We need 10 times to 20 times the activity that has already started if we're going to achieve, well, our necessary climate ambition.
Thank you. Any other final comments from our panelists?
Just, you know, I've been in finance for a long time. People can do this. They can make excuses of why they can't do it, or they're waiting for the TPT to come out with guidance, or get on with it. This is your business. You've got to show investors what you're doing for the future. The investors want to know what your plans are and opportunities. Honestly, the time for waiting is gone. We're pushing hard. There's a lot of good companies already doing it, and everyone should be doing it.
I like that message.
Sure. So last thought is around, we've talked a lot about net zero. Obviously, we're at this net zero conference or summit or whatever it's called, Congress. But the transition planning frameworks that we've talked about are applicable to other issues. And Sean was talking about adaptation. Obviously, that's key. If you look at the guidance and the disclosure framework that we've produced, we really bring out and reference climate adaptation and resilience issues within that. We've also had working groups within the TPT that have looked at just transition and nature recovery and how those things can also relate to transition plans and transition planning. So I think we're going to end up with kind of holistic sustainability transition plans that obviously, net zero is key, but look at these other issues as well, and the framework is extendable to those issues.
Thank you, Ben, for taking off our carbon blinders there. I'm going to give the last word to Emily then. Ben used the word just transition. How can international standards ensure that we have a more inclusive transition?
I love that as a final thought to end on. There's two ways, both in the technical content and also in the governance structure. So as I've mentioned already, one of the unique value adds of the international standard system and something we call quality infrastructure is that it represents, by definition, the voices and national needs of countries around the world. So if you looked at that address I gave you earlier, iso.org/members, you'll see that map of the world, and you'll see a lot of red with all of the different countries covered by a government-appointed national standards body, with many of them also complemented by accreditation services. So in the UK, that is UCAS, literally the UK Accreditation Service, metrology and measurement labs, and also a number of accredited conformity assessment bodies. That infrastructure already exists, and they are designed and set up and funded specifically to make sure they are reflecting the unique needs of their jurisdiction in the development of international standards. And I think we can all acknowledge that the proliferation of guidance and rule setting to date in a lot of climate action has predominantly come from, for lack of a better term, global north initiatives and institutions. Now, obviously, where more resource exists, more resource should be leveraged to take action, so there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But we need to be, as standard setters and also as experts in this community, conscious of where we may have blind spots. And that's exactly where the international standard system can help, by making sure that experts in every country can come together and agree by consensus if something works for them. Because we may think we know what the technical requirements for a just transition are, but have we asked everyone in all of the countries that we are claiming we're helping? Now, I'm not implying that the excellent work that's been done hasn't done so, but we need to make sure that we're doing it regularly and through an existing system set up to elevate those voices. And the other way, as mentioned already, is, of course, the technical content and making sure that we're capturing the real transformative element, which I think my co-panelists have brought out brilliantly in this discussion, which is you need to change your culture. I think that's even a sub-element of the TPT. You need to transform the way you think. You need to change your business model. This is not, as Ben has alluded to, this is not a paper decarbonisation or an accounting exercise. There are going to be some things. If we think net zero is a wicked problem, get ready for adaptation. So there are whole new ways in which we need to reimagine how this looks. So we can draw on the excellent work already done on a just transition and make sure we're scaling that into the system. But crucially, we can also make sure we're developing this guidance in the first place with the input live of the experts that we need to draw on from those more emerging economies and developing regions. That, I think, will go down much better with them if we're developing it with them rather than developing it and then going out for consultation and asking them what they think afterwards. So that, again, my final word will be just a reminder, call to action. If you are not already connected to the system, please do consider joining your national standards body, Climate Change Management Committee, so that you can make sure your expertise and your solutions are reflected in international standards.
Thank you. And on that inclusive note, I invite you all to come speak with us after. It's been delightful to be here with you all, and thank you so much to our incredible panelists.
Hope you enjoyed the silent disco.